The courtroom was a grand yet unassuming space, the kind of place where justice was supposed to be blind, but the people inside it had long since learned otherwise. The wooden panels of the walls bore the marks of years of trials, whispered deals, and verdicts handed down with varying degrees of fairness. The air carried the scent of polished oak, stale coffee, and the faint musk of sweat, as if the room itself had absorbed decades of tension, power struggles, and quiet desperation. Seated at the defendant's table, Lieutenant Chad Wilkins exuded an air of smugness that was impossible to ignore. His uniform, crisp and freshly pressed, clung to his broad shoulders, as though the fabric itself was afraid to crease under his arrogance. A lazy smirk played at his lips as he leaned back in his chair, legs slightly spread apart, arms draped casually over the armrests, as if he were a king surveying his court. He chewed his gum with slow, deliberate motions, the rhythmic snap of it loud in the otherwise quiet room. It was a sound that carried all the way to the prosecution's table, where Camille Carter sat, silent and composed. Unlike Wilkins, Camille didn't need to fill the room with bravado. She sat with an air of quiet confidence, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her back straight. She was a woman who had seen the worst humanity had to offer and had come out the other side stronger, not broken. Her dark brown skin gleamed under the courtroom lights, her features sharp yet unreadable. Her eyes, dark and piercing, held none of the fear or anger that many before her had shown when facing the uniformed man on trial. Instead, she regarded him with a measured stillness, like a predator watching its prey, waiting not out of hesitation, but because it knew exactly when to strike. Wilkins was on trial for assault with excessive force. The details of the case had been spread thin by the media, the headlines cherry-picked for the public's consumption. What they hadn't printed, however, was the sheer brutality of the incident. They hadn't detailed the way Wilkins had slammed Camille against the hood of his patrol car, how he had twisted her arm behind her back so hard that her shoulder had popped, how he had dragged her along the pavement like a captured animal. They hadn't described the look of satisfaction on his face as he pressed his boot against her back, pushing her into the concrete while she bled from a split lip. Most importantly, they hadn't mentioned that he had no idea who she was. He hadn't known that Camille Carter wasn't just another woman to be humiliated and discarded. He hadn't known that she was a retired military operative, a former high-ranking federal investigator, a woman trained to break men twice his size both physically and psychologically. And that was why he was in this courtroom now, because for once, he had picked the wrong person to brutalize. A hush fell over the courtroom as Judge Raymond Collins entered. He was a man in his late 60s, grizzled but steady, his face worn by years of presiding over cases where justice didn't always win. His reputation was a mix of fairness and stern practicality. He took one long look at the people in front of him, the uniformed defendant with too much confidence, the composed yet lethal woman at the prosecution's table, and sighed inwardly. He had seen cases like this before, where the police force circled the wagons, protecting their own. But something about this one was different. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the room collectively obeyed. Wilkins rose lazily, his smirk still present, while Camille stood smoothly, her eyes never leaving him. He met her gaze, and for a fleeting second, something passed between them, something unspoken but heavy. It was the silent acknowledgement of power, of control shifting from one hand to another. Wilkins didn't like it. As everyone sat down again, the proceedings began. "Lieutenant Wilkins, you are facing charges of excessive force and misconduct in the arrest of Camille Carter," Judge Collins stated, his voice steady but firm. "How do you plead?" Wilkins barely hesitated. "Not guilty, Your Honor." His voice was relaxed, confident, as though this was nothing more than a formality before he walked out a free man. His lawyer, Harvey Lennox, a sharp-dressed man with slicked-back hair and a reputation for getting dirty cops off the hook, leaned in and whispered something in his ear. Wilkins chuckled softly, his eyes darting back to Camille. Camille didn't react. She didn't blink. She simply watched. The prosecutor, Elliot Grayson, stood next. He was young but sharp, an up-and-comer who had made a name for himself by taking on tough cases that others wouldn't touch. He adjusted his tie before speaking. "Your Honor, the prosecution will prove that Lieutenant Wilkins knowingly used excessive force during what should have been a routine interaction. The evidence, including medical records, surveillance footage, and witness testimony, will show that he did so without just cause and with deliberate malice." Grayson's words were clear and precise, but Wilkins barely paid attention. He leaned toward Lennox, whispering, "Let's get this over with." "I've got a dinner reservation at 7. Camille heard him. A slow smile ghosted across her lips, so faint that it might have been imagined. The judge motioned for the prosecution to proceed, and the first witness was called. Dr. Anthony Wells, the forensic medical examiner, took the stand. He was an older man, no stranger to cases involving police brutality, and he spoke with a weary professionalism. The injuries sustained by Ms. Carter were not consistent with a simple detainment, Wells explained, flipping through the medical reports. She suffered a dislocated shoulder, multiple bruises along her ribs and back, abrasions on her face and arms. The pattern of injuries suggests that she was forcibly restrained with unnecessary force, beyond what was needed to subdue a non-violent civilian. Wilkins laughed. A genuine, full-bodied laugh that echoed in the quiet room. "Jesus," he said, shaking his head. "You'd think I shot her or something. This is ridiculous." The laughter was like gasoline on an open flame. Judge Collins' gaze darkened, but he kept his composure. "Lieutenant Wilkins, I strongly advise you to take these proceedings seriously." "Oh, I am Wilkins," replied, still grinning. "It's just funny, that's all. We're wasting taxpayer money on this? I've seen worse fights in a kindergarten." Grayson clenched his jaw. Camille, however, did nothing. Her eyes never left Wilkins. Wilkins leaned back in his chair, stretching out. "Let's wrap this up," he murmured to Lennox. "I'm done listening to sob stories." Then, for the first time in the entire proceeding, Camille spoke. Her voice was calm, measured, dangerous. "You're done," she repeated softly. Wilkins turned to her, the smirk still lingering. "Yeah, sweetheart. I'm done." Camille tilted her head slightly, her fingers drumming against the table. "You don't even realize it yet, do you?" Wilkins frowned. "Realize what?" Camille leaned in, just a fraction. "That you've already lost, and for the first time," Wilkins' smirk faltered. The courtroom remained tense, the air thick with an unspoken challenge between Camille Carter and Lieutenant Chad Wilkins. The arrogance that dripped from his every movement was slowly beginning to curdle, shifting into something more rigid, less self-assured, and more defensive. For the first time, the smirk he had worn like a badge of honor was showing signs of strain. Camille's words had landed with the weight of something final, something inevitable, and though he wouldn't admit it, something inside him had shifted. Judge Collins cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had settled after Camille's chilling statement. "Let's proceed," he said, signaling to the prosecutor. Elliot Grayson nodded and turned his attention back to the forensic examiner, Dr. Wells. "Doctor, you mentioned that Ms. Carter's injuries were not consistent with a lawful detainment," Grayson continued, his voice controlled, but with an underlying sharpness. "Could you elaborate on what exactly you mean by that?" Dr. Wells adjusted his glasses, flipping through his medical reports. "Of course. The force applied to MS. Carter's shoulder was excessive to the point of causing a near dislocation. If she hadn't been in peak physical condition, it's likely she would have suffered a full separation of the joint, which would have required surgical correction. Additionally, the bruising pattern along her ribs suggests that significant weight was applied, likely a knee or a foot forcing her against the pavement for an extended period of time. Wilkins chuckled, shaking his head. "Jesus Christ," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the room to hear. "The way you're talking, you'd think I left her in a coma." Camille didn't flinch. She simply kept watching him, her gaze unwavering. Doctor Wells, unbothered by the interruption, continued. "What's particularly telling, however, is the nature of the bruising along her arms and wrists. These are not the marks of simple restraint. They indicate an intentional twisting motion, commonly associated with joint manipulation techniques meant to cause pain rather than subdue." Grayson turned back to the witness stand. "So, to clarify, in your professional opinion, the actions taken by Lieutenant Wilkins were not simply part of standard police procedure, but instead deliberate acts of excessive force?" Dr. Wells nodded. "That would be a correct assessment." Judge Collins shifted in his seat, turning toward Wilkins. "Lieutenant, do you have any response to this testimony?" Wilkins exhaled sharply, running a hand over his jaw. "Yeah," he said with an exaggerated shrug. "I did my job. She resisted. I subdued her. End of story. Maybe next time she'll learn not to make things so difficult." Grayson's jaw tightened, and before he could speak, Camille leaned forward slightly. "Difficult," she repeated, her voice low and smooth, the edge of steel beneath the surface. Wilkins turned his head, giving her a once-over, as if seeing her for the first time. "Yeah, difficult. You people always gotta act like you're above the law, like the rules don't apply to you." There it was. The mask slipped, if only for a moment, and the courtroom caught a glimpse of what lay beneath the core of the man who had brutalized Camille Carter that night. The carefully constructed facade of a no-nonsense officer maintaining law and order crumbled, revealing the entitled, rage-driven thug that lurked just beneath. Judge Collins narrowed his eyes. "Lieutenant, I strongly suggest you choose your words carefully." Wilkins sat up straighter, his grin returning. "Just calling it like I see it, Your Honor." Camille exhaled slowly, the first real sign of anything resembling emotion flashing through her otherwise stoic exterior. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something colder, something patient. Grayson took a step forward. "Lieutenant Wilkins, let's be clear about something, MS. Carter was unarmed. She had committed no crime. She had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you made a judgment call based not on evidence or reasonable suspicion, but on your own personal biases." Wilkins scoffed. "Biases? Give me a break. I didn't know who she was. She looked like a problem. I dealt with it." "And that's exactly why you're here," Grayson fired back. "Because you didn't know who she was. If you had, would you have done the same thing?" Wilkins hesitated for just a moment. "Just long enough." Camille smiled. You wouldn't have," she said softly, almost like a whisper. "You pick your victims carefully, don't you? You thought I was just another woman, another face in the crowd. You thought you could get away with it." Wilkins' nostrils flared slightly, his muscles tensing. "Lady, you don't know a damn thing about me." Camille tilted her head. "Oh, but I do." Silence fell over the room. Wilkins blinked, a flicker of unease breaking through his bravado. Camille reached forward, resting her fingertips lightly against the table in front of her. "You see, I know men like you," she continued, her voice soft yet unwavering. "Men who hide behind their badges because they think it gives them power. Men who pick fights with people who can't fight back because it makes them feel strong. Men who mistake cruelty for control. She leaned in, just slightly. But control isn't taking cheap shots at people who can't defend themselves. Control isn't slamming a woman against a patrol car because it makes you feel bigger. Control is what happens when you realize you've just walked into the one fight you can't win. Wilkins' jaw tightened. You think you can intimidate me? Camille's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. No, I think you already are. Wilkins sat back, exhaling through his nose, his fingers curling against the armrest of his chair. The room was dead silent. Even the judge, normally quick to interrupt, said nothing. The shift in power was palpable. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. All heads turned as a man entered, walking with deliberate, measured steps. His presence alone seemed to suck the air from the room, the weight of him pressing against the atmosphere. Dressed in an immaculate suit, his posture straight and composed, his sharp blue eyes cutting across the room like a blade. It was Clint Eastwood. Whispers broke out instantly, hushed voices murmuring in disbelief as he strode toward the prosecution's table, his gaze locked on Wilkins. The lieutenant's expression faltered for the first time. Camille simply leaned back in her chair, folding her arms loosely across her chest, watching as realization dawned in Wilkins' eyes. Watching as, for the first time, he seemed to understand. Camille turned slightly, glancing toward the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice still calm, still utterly composed. "I believe we have a new witness." Judge Collins looked from her to Eastwood, then back again. His fingers tapped against the wood of his podium. "Well," he murmured. This just got interesting. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The presence of Clint Eastwood alone was enough to send a ripple of unease through the room. But it was the way he carried himself, silent, deliberate, utterly composed, that made the weight of his arrival feel inescapable. The murmurs that had spread like wildfire upon his entrance had died down, leaving only the heavy, expectant hush that preceded something seismic. Lieutenant Chad Wilkins shifted uncomfortably in his seat for the first time since the trial had begun. His arrogant smirk had faltered, his shoulders no longer slouched in careless amusement. Instead, his jaw clenched tight, his hands curling into fists beneath the table, the tendons in his neck standing out like wires drawn too taut. He was still trying to play it cool, but the sweat starting to form at his temple betrayed him. Camille Carter, however, remained unmoved. She had expected this. Every reaction, every tremor of discomfort from Wilkins had been meticulously planned. She had spent years mastering the art of psychological warfare, learning how to read the shift in a man's breathing, the tightening of his jaw, the way his pupils dilated when he realized he had made a critical error. And right now, Wilkins was making them all. Judge Collins adjusted his glasses, leaning slightly forward, his gaze flicking between Camille, Eastwood, and Wilkins. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice measured but carrying a tone of curiosity. "I wasn't aware you had any involvement in this case." Eastwood stopped in the middle of the room, standing between the prosecution and defense tables like a judge in his own right. His hands rested casually in the pockets of his tailored jacket, his weathered face betraying nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was gravel low, slow, the kind of voice that carried without ever needing to be raised. "I don't get involved in just any case, Your Honor," he said simply. "Only the ones that matter." Wilkins swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Judge Collins studied him carefully before nodding once. "Then I'll allow it. You're sworn in as a witness." Clint nodded, stepping forward as the bailiff quickly administered the oath. When it was done, he took a seat on the witness stand, crossing one leg over the other, as though he were settling in for something far more casual than what was about to unfold. The prosecutor, Elliot Grayson, cleared his throat, shifting into his usual authoritative stance. But before he could speak, Eastwood raised a single hand, stopping him in his tracks. "I'll make this easy for everyone," he said, turning his gaze onto Wilkins with the kind of look that made grown men reconsider their life choices. "This isn't about excessive force. This isn't about a misunderstanding or police protocol gone wrong. This is about a man who spent his whole career believing he could get away with anything." The words landed like hammer blows against concrete. Wilkins straightened in his seat, his bravado flickering back to life out of pure survival instinct. "With all due respect, Mr. Eastwood, I don't even know why you're here. You think because you're some big shot, you can just walk in here and—" "You talk too much," Eastwood cut him off, his voice like a razor across skin. "That's your problem. You talk when you should be listening." The courtroom was so quiet that even the air seemed hesitant to move. Wilkins opened his mouth, then shut it again. Camille watched it all unfold with the same cool detachment, her gaze never wavering from Wilkins' face. He was unraveling, just like she knew he would. Grayson, realizing that Eastwood was now in full control of the room, wisely stepped back. "Then tell us," he said, gesturing with an open palm. "What do you know about Lieutenant Wilkins?" Eastwood leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know that in the last 5 years he's had 27 formal complaints filed against him. I know that of those 27, 15 were for unnecessary use of force. I know that 3 of those were from minors, 2 of which never made it to court because their families were persuaded to drop the charges." Wilkins' lawyer, Harvey Lennox, immediately stood. "Objection, Your Honor. This is—" Overruled, Judge Collins said without hesitation. "Continue, Mr. Eastwood." Eastwood didn't miss a beat. "I know that last year, Wilkins was investigated for falsifying evidence in a drug bust, planting narcotics on a suspect who later served 6 months before the case was overturned." He tilted his head slightly. "But the department covered that one up real nice, didn't they?" A muscle in Wilkins' cheek twitched. "And I know," Eastwood continued, his voice dropping just slightly, "that the reason you were so confident walking into this courtroom today is because every single time you've done something like this, you've walked away clean." Wilkins' chest rose and fell in sharp bursts, his breathing uneven. "This is—" "Shut up," Eastwood said. Not even raising his voice, Wilkins did. For the first time since the trial began, he looked lost. Camille's lips twitched, just slightly. Wilkins turned to his lawyer. "Do something," he hissed under his breath. Lennox leaned in, whispering furiously, but whatever he was saying wasn't helping, because Wilkins' face was growing redder by the second. And then Camille decided to twist the knife. She stood, slowly, deliberately. "You always thought you were untouchable," she said, stepping toward Wilkins' table with the precision of a hunter closing in. "Every time you threw someone to the ground, every time you put your knee on someone's back and called it procedure, every time you saw the fear in someone's eyes and knew you could do whatever you wanted because your badge would protect you, you thought no one would ever make you answer for it." She stopped right in front of him. "But here you are." Wilkins shoved his chair back, standing so fast that it nearly toppled over. His face was burning, his breath coming in sharp, furious bursts. "You think you're so goddamn smart, don't you?" he spat. Camille just smiled. And then Wilkins snapped. With a sharp, furious movement, he lunged forward, his hands shooting out toward her, his rage overriding whatever semblance of control he had left. But Camille was faster. Before his fingers could so much as graze her, she sidestepped effortlessly, catching his wrist in a vice-like grip. With a single, fluid motion, she twisted hard. There was a sickening pop. Wilkins let out a strangled cry, his knees buckling as his arm was wrenched behind his back with expert precision. He tried to struggle, but Camille applied just the right amount of pressure, keeping him locked in place. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Officers leapt from their seats. Lennox shouted something incoherent. Judge Collins banged his gavel, demanding order, but none of it mattered. Because Camille leaned in, her lips just inches from Wilkins' ear, and whispered, "You're not untouchable anymore," and then she let him go. Wilkins stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder, his breath ragged, his entire body shaking with pain and fury. He turned, wild-eyed, to Judge Collins. She attacked me." Collins simply stared at him. Then, ever so slowly, he set down his gavel and leaned forward. "Lieutenant Wilkins," he said, his voice as cold as ice, "for the first time in your life, you are going to sit down and shut up." Wilkins did. Because this time there was no getting out of it. This time, he had already lost. The courtroom was a storm barely contained within four walls. The energy in the air crackled, thick with the weight of everything that had just transpired. Wilkins, humiliated, shaken and physically rattled, sat frozen in his chair. His right arm hung limply at his side, the shoulder wrenched from Camille's expert maneuver, and though he clenched his jaw in an attempt to hide the pain, everyone could see it. Sweat glistened along his brow, his breath coming in shallow gasps as his body tried to process what had just happened. His entire career, his entire identity, had been built on the idea that he was untouchable, but in mere seconds, Camille Carter had shattered that illusion in front of an entire courtroom. Judge Collins sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle before finally leaning forward, eyes locked onto Wilkins. "Lieutenant, I believe I gave you an order. You will remain seated and silent unless directly addressed. Do you understand me?" Wilkins didn't answer at first. His pride wouldn't let him. He was Wilkins, the man who had run unchecked for years, the man who had bent the law to his will whenever it suited him. But today, for the first time, he was losing. And worse, everyone was watching. "I said," Collins repeated, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who had run too many courtrooms to tolerate anything less than obedience. "Do you understand me?" Wilkins exhaled through clenched teeth. "Yes, Your Honor," he finally muttered, his voice barely more than a growl. "Good," Collins said flatly. He turned to the prosecution. "Mr. Grayson, let's move forward." Grayson, who had been standing quietly with his hands behind his back, perfectly aware of the shifting tide in the room, nodded once and stepped toward the witness stand. Clint Eastwood, still seated, still composed as though nothing had happened, met his gaze and gave a small nod of his own. "Mr. Eastwood," Grayson began, his voice cool and methodical, "you just detailed multiple instances of misconduct by Lieutenant Wilkins. What I'd like to ask next is simple. Why is it that these cases never resulted in disciplinary action?" Eastwood exhaled slowly, the deep rumble of his breath filling the quiet space. He adjusted his jacket before answering, his voice measured and calm. "Because men like him don't work alone." Wilkins' head snapped up at that. Collins lifted a brow. "Explain," he said simply. Eastwood turned his attention back to Wilkins, but there was no anger in his expression, just certainty, the look of a man who had seen this kind of corruption too many times to be surprised by it anymore. "The reason Wilkins has gotten away with everything he's done isn't just because of his own ego or recklessness," Eastwood continued. "It's because he's always had someone watching his back, someone pulling strings, making sure every complaint, every investigation, every potential consequence disappeared before it could ever touch him." Lennox, Wilkins' lawyer, stood abruptly. "Your Honor, I have to object." unless Mr. Eastwood has concrete evidence. Eastwood didn't even glance at him. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folder. With the same slow deliberation that had made Wilkins sweat since the moment he'd walked into the courtroom, he handed it to Grayson. Every cover-up, Eastwood said. Every internal memo. Every falsified report. Grayson took the folder, flipping it open and scanning its contents. His expression remained neutral, but a muscle in his jaw twitched a subtle sign of what he was reading. Wilkins, despite the pain lancing through his shoulder, stood abruptly. This is bullshit. Collins narrowed his eyes. Lieutenant, sit down. Wilkins didn't. He couldn't. He felt it now, the walls closing in. This wasn't just about Camille Carter anymore. This was everything. Everything he had buried. Everything he had done. And for the first time in his life, it was all coming back. You think you can just walk in here and throw accusations around? Wilkins spat, his voice rough and desperate. His gaze darted between Camille Eastwood and Grayson. He was searching for a way out. You think you can just... We don't think, Camille interrupted smoothly, rising from her seat once again. We know. Wilkins turned on her, his teeth bared. I should have put you in the goddamn ground. The courtroom went dead silent. Judge Collins let out a slow breath, gripping his gavel so tightly his knuckles whitened. Lieutenant Wilkins, he said, his voice dropping to something cold, something almost lethal, I highly suggest you consider your next words very carefully. Wilkins' chest heaved. His fingers twitched at his side, as though he were reaching for something that wasn't there. He was a man who had built his life on power, on control, on being feared, and now, stripped of all of it, he had nothing left but rage. And then he snapped. With a sudden burst of movement, he lunged not toward Camille but toward Eastwood. It was a mistake. Eastwood didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink, because Camille was faster. She caught Wilkins mid-stride, her body pivoting smoothly as she sidestepped his charge. In one fluid motion, she planted a fist into his gut, forcing the air from his lungs in a sharp, strangled wheeze. Wilkins staggered, his balance breaking, but Camille didn't stop. With practiced precision, she caught his already injured arm, twisting it behind his back and slamming him down onto the prosecution's table. Papers and documents scattered as Wilkins let out a pained shout, his face contorted in shock and agony. For the second time that day, Camille had him pinned. The officers in the room started forward, some out of instinct, some out of years of unthinking loyalty, but Eastwood raised a single hand, stopping them in their tracks. Judge Collins, now standing, slammed his gavel down once. Order. The entire room froze. Camille didn't let go. She leaned in, her lips inches from Wilkins' ear, her breath slow and controlled. You know what your biggest mistake was, she murmured. You never learned when to stop. Wilkins' breathing was erratic, his entire body trembling beneath her weight. He tried to struggle, but it was no use. He was done. Collins exhaled sharply. MS. Carter. Let him go. Slowly, deliberately, Camille released her grip and stepped back. Wilkins didn't move. He just lay there, face pressed against the table, his body racked with pain, his pride in ruins. Grayson turned to Collins. Your Honor, given the blatant confession of premeditated harm against my client and the overwhelming evidence of misconduct, I move for an immediate conviction. Collins studied the scene before him, the scattered papers, the broken man gasping for breath, the woman who had never once lost control. He nodded. Motion granted. The weight of the moment hung in the air like a storm cloud, thick and suffocating, pressing down on everyone in the room. The energy had shifted entirely. no longer resembling a courtroom trial but something far more visceral, something raw and untamed, as if the very walls had absorbed the decades of injustice that had played out within them and were now witnessing a reckoning unlike any before. Lieutenant Chad Wilkins, the man who had strutted into this space as though he owned it, the man who had laughed in the face of his accusers, the man who had sat in his chair with an air of untouchability, was no longer that man at all. He was something else now, something unrecognizable even to himself. His breaths were uneven, his muscles twitching involuntarily, his body attempting to reconcile the humiliation that had just been forced upon it with the sheer disbelief that it had happened at all. For so long he had been the one in control. For so long he had dictated how things would play out. For so long he had believed that there was no force greater than his ability to wield power without consequence. And yet here he was, hunched over in pain, his world cracking apart at the seams, his body betraying him as it failed to summon the bravado he had always relied on to maintain his illusion of dominance. He swallowed hard, but it felt like gravel scraping down his throat, his pulse hammering in his ears as he forced himself upright, his pride screaming at him to stand his ground, even when every instinct inside of him begged him to retreat. Judge Collins exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the edge of his bench as he surveyed the scene before him, the remnants of Wilkins' shattered composure littering the floor like broken glass. There was no going back from this. The line had been crossed, burned into the ground, and there was no way to pretend otherwise. He could see it in the way Wilkins' shoulders heaved with each breath, in the way his fingers curled into fists that he was too weak to lift, in the way his eyes darted around the room as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. The realization had begun to settle in there would be no escape, no last-minute save, no miraculous loophole to exploit. This was real, this was happening, and for the first time in his life, Wilkins was being made to answer for what he had done. The thought alone sent another wave of humiliation crashing over him, drowning him in the bitter taste of his own downfall. Camille Carter stood across from him, her presence as unwavering as a mountain, her gaze locked onto him with the kind of quiet intensity that sent shivers down even the most hardened spines. She had said very little since bringing him to his knees, but she didn't need to say much. Her silence spoke louder than any words ever could. She had already won. She had won the moment he lashed out, the moment he lost control, the moment he proved to everyone in that room that everything he had built his career upon, his authority, his intimidation, his power, had been nothing more than smoke and mirrors. And now, stripped of it all, he had been reduced to nothing but a trembling man desperately trying to hold onto the remnants of an illusion that had already crumbled to dust beneath him. The sound of Eastwood shifting in his seat sent another jolt through Wilkins' system, his instincts screaming at him to brace for whatever came next. He turned his head slowly, locking eyes with the man who had entered this courtroom and dismantled his entire reality with nothing more than the weight of his presence. Eastwood had seen men like Wilkins before. He had seen the way they carried themselves, the way they mistook fear for respect, the way they built their identities on the suffering of others and convinced themselves that they were above retribution. He had seen them rise, and he had seen them fall, and now he was seeing it happen again, right in front of him, with the inevitability of a tide washing over a crumbling shore. Wilkins' lip curled in frustration, in anger, in something dangerously close to desperation, his mind scrambling for a way to regain even the smallest semblance of control. But it was useless. There was nothing left for him to grasp onto. No one in this room was on his side, not even his own attorney, whose silence was deafening, whose refusal to meet his gaze made it painfully clear that even he had accepted the reality of what was happening. Wilkins had lost, and there was nothing he could do to change it. "You've spent your whole life hurting people," Eastwood finally spoke, his voice calm, steady, terrifyingly unwavering. Now you know what it feels like. The words hit Wilkins like a hammer to the gut, knocking the wind out of him in a way that had nothing to do with physical pain. It was the kind of statement that didn't require elaboration, that didn't need to be reinforced with anything more. It was final, it was absolute, and it was true. Wilkins clenched his teeth, his jaw so tight that it felt like it might shatter under the pressure, but he had no words left. There was nothing he could say to refute it, no argument he could make, no justification that would hold any weight anymore. The walls were closing in, suffocating him with the reality that had once seemed so distant, so impossible, so unfathomable. And yet here it was, pressing against him from all sides, crushing him beneath the weight of something he had never believed would reach him justice. Judge Collins straightened, clearing his throat before speaking, his voice ringing through the silence with the authority of a man who was about to deliver something irrevocable. Lieutenant Wilkins, given the overwhelming evidence presented, the testimonies given, and your own actions in this courtroom, I find you guilty on all charges. The words settled over the room like a heavy blanket, final and immovable, the reality of them sinking into Wilkins' bones like ice. He felt the world tilting beneath him, his mind struggling to keep up, to process what had just been said. You will be remanded into custody immediately and held without bail until sentencing. Collins continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. Bailiffs, remove the defendant. The two officers who had been standing near the doors moved forward, their hands already reaching for Wilkins as he instinctively recoiled. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They grabbed his arms, yanking him up from where he had collapsed against the table, his legs barely supporting him as they dragged him toward the exit. The humiliation was unbearable, worse than the pain in his arm, worse than the hit to his gut, worse than anything he had ever imagined. He had spent years watching people be hauled away in cuffs, smirking as he sent them off to their fates without a second thought. And now, it was him. It was his life being dismantled, his future being torn apart, his name being stained beyond repair. The realization hit him like a freight train, and for the first time, he felt what it was like to be truly, completely powerless. As he was dragged past Camille, she didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She didn't say anything at all. She simply watched as he was escorted out like the criminal he was, watched as the reality of his defeat settled into his bones, watched as he disappeared from sight, leaving behind nothing but the wreckage of his own destruction. The doors shut behind him. And just like that, it was over. The walls of the courtroom felt like they were closing in, the energy in the air thick and electric, every person in the room caught in the gravitational pull of a moment they would never forget. Wilkins' breath was uneven, his body struggling between the desperate urge to fight back and the inescapable truth pressing down on him like an iron weight. He had always known he was hated, had always known there were whispers about the way he conducted himself on the job, about the bruises he left, the fear he instilled, but those whispers had never mattered, because he had never been made to answer for them. Until now. He was still processing the judge's words, still reeling from the sound of that final, damning verdict, guilty on all charges. His ears rang with it, his mind playing it over and over, unable to accept that this was real, that he had actually lost. The officers holding him up felt like a cage around him, their grips firm, unyielding, but that wasn't what suffocated him. No, it was the realization that everything he had built had crumbled. There was no backup plan, no escape route, no department willing to shield him, no good old boys club stepping in to make sure he walked out of here with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. The very people he had once called allies, the ones who had laughed with him in bars, covered for him when things got too messy, those men weren't standing up for him now. They weren't speaking on his behalf, weren't pushing back against the verdict. They were sitting there watching, silent, their eyes locked on the wreckage of a man who had ruled them through fear, but now had no power left. His stomach twisted as he caught sight of one of the younger officers in the back, a rookie he had hazed mercilessly. A kid he had made fetch him coffee like some kind of errand boy, and the bastard was smirking. That was the final insult. The one thing that made Wilkins' jaw tighten so hard he thought his teeth might shatter. Then there was her. Camille Carter. The woman he had once thought of as nothing more than an easy target, a face that would blur into the countless others he had thrown against police cars, pinned to the ground, left in cuffs until the adrenaline in his blood cooled and he got bored. She was still standing, still watching him, her presence towering over him in a way that no physical size could ever account for. She wasn't gloating. That was the worst part. If she had been smirking, if she had mocked him, he could have handled that. But instead, she was calm, the look in her eyes saying what words never could. This was always going to happen. You were never as strong as you thought you were. You just never met someone who knew how to break you before now. That was what sent something sharp and violent lurching inside him. That was what made the rage explode through his veins like fire. His vision tunneled, his body moving before his mind could catch up. The grip of the officers didn't matter, nothing mattered except the blind need to wipe that look off her face, to prove he still had something left. His muscles tensed, his body surging forward with all the force he could summon, and he lunged at her with a snarl ripping from his throat. He wanted to grab her, throw her, hurt her, make her feel even a fraction of what he was feeling now. He didn't care that he was cuffed, didn't care that everyone was watching, didn't care that this was the dumbest thing he could possibly do. All that mattered was taking something back. But Camille was already moving. Faster than him. She sidestepped effortlessly, her foot slamming into his shin with a precision that sent shockwaves of pain ripping through his nerves. Before he could even register the agony, before his body could process the fact that he was already losing this fight, her fist connected with his jaw, snapping his head to the side so violently that he saw white. The force of the blow sent him sprawling, his knees buckling, his body crashing to the ground in a way that was far too familiar, only this time he was the one face down, the one struggling to breathe, the one who had just been overpowered in front of everyone he had ever tried to intimidate. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, shouts, the sound of bodies shifting, but Camille wasn't done. In one fluid motion she was on him, her knee pressing into his spine, her hand locking onto the back of his neck, holding him down in the exact same way he had done to her. Her breath was steady, completely unaffected by the struggle, while his came out in shaky, pathetic bursts. His mind screamed at him to fight back, to regain some kind of control, but he couldn't. His body had betrayed him. His strength had failed him. And now he was here, pinned to the cold, unforgiving floor, powerless for the first time in his life. She leaned in, close enough that only he could hear her. "I want you to remember this," Wilkins, her voice was smooth, unshaken, dangerous in its finality. "I want you to think about it every second of every day for the rest of your miserable life. Because no matter where you go from here, no matter what you try to tell yourself, you will always know the truth." Her fingers pressed just slightly against his neck, not hurting, not yet, but a clear reminder that she could. You were never a real man. You were just a scared little boy playing dress-up. And now, her lips barely parted as she whispered the last words. Now everyone else knows it too. His entire body shuddered. She stood, stepping back as the officers rushed in, finally remembering their jobs, dragging him up from the floor as his vision swam, his head still spinning from the hit, his legs barely able to hold him up. His mouth tasted like copper and humiliation, and when he tried to meet Camille's eyes again, he couldn't. He looked away. He had no choice. Judge Collins rubbed a hand over his face, letting out a breath as he watched the wreckage that had once been Chad Wilkins. "Well," he muttered, shaking his head. "That was overdue." No one argued. Camille smoothed out her sleeves, exhaling as though she had just finished something completely mundane. She turned toward the door, feeling Eastwood's gaze on her, sensing his approval without needing to hear it. He had been right about everything. She had been right about everything. Justice wasn't given, it was taken, and today it had been delivered. As she reached for the door, she heard the judge's voice call after her. "MS. Carter," she paused, glancing over her shoulder. "You ever think about working in law enforcement?" His voice was half amused, half serious. She chuckled under her breath, shaking her head. Not a chance, and then she stepped through the doors, leaving behind the ruins of a man who would never be feared again. The sound of the courthouse doors slamming shut behind her felt like the final punctuation on a sentence that had been years in the making. The air outside was thick with anticipation, the weight of dozens of stairs pressing down on Camille Carter as she stepped onto the courthouse steps, but she didn't rush. She moved with the same measured control she had displayed in the courtroom, each step steady, each breath deliberate, her pulse finally beginning to slow now that it was over. The trial, the fight, the confrontation, it was finished, and Wilkins, for the first time in his life, was the one dragged away in chains instead of tightening them around someone else's wrists. But she felt no satisfaction in that. No elation. Justice, when delivered properly, was not a victory, it was a correction, an overdue reckoning for something that should have never been allowed to happen in the first place. The crowd outside was dense, a mixture of reporters, onlookers, and those who had come simply to see if the system would work this time, if it would do what it was supposed to instead of bending under the weight of corruption and cowardice. Some faces were familiar activists who had spent years fighting against officers like Wilkins, people who had shouted until their throats were raw at protests, demanding someone listen. Others were strangers, drawn to the case by the media storm that had surrounded it. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved forward, voices overlapped in a chaotic chorus of questions and demands. "MS. Carter, do you feel that justice has been served today? Do you believe Wilkins' conviction will lead to real change in law enforcement? Will you be pursuing civil action against the police department? What do you have to say to the victims who never got their day in court?" She ignored them all. She had spoken in that courtroom. She had spoken in the way she moved, the way she fought, the way she had refused to let Wilkins walk away from what he had done, and that was enough. The world had already heard her, whether they wanted to or not. She wasn't here to feed headlines. She wasn't here to give them a soundbite they could play over and over on the evening news. She was here to walk away because she had done what needed to be done, and there was nothing left to say. She descended the steps with purpose, not looking left or right, not acknowledging the hands that reached out or the voices that called her name. There were still battles to fight, still wars being waged in courtrooms and streets and precincts all over the country, but this one was over. This one had ended the only way it could have, the only way it should have. A sleek black car was waiting for her at the curb, and leaning against it, arms crossed, was Clint Eastwood. His presence was as commanding as ever, his stance relaxed yet watchful, his eyes hidden behind the tint of his aviators, but she could feel the weight of his gaze tracking her every movement. As she reached him, he let out a low whistle, shaking his head slightly. "Hell of a thing you did in there," he said, his voice as dry as ever, but there was something underneath it, something almost like approval. "Didn't think you had it in you." Camille exhaled through her nose, tilting her head slightly as she regarded him. "Then you weren't paying attention." A low chuckle rumbled in his chest, and he nodded once, conceding the point. He pushed off the car, opening the passenger door with a flick of his wrist. "Get in. You look like you could use a drink." She hesitated for only a second before slipping inside, the door closing with a quiet, decisive click. As the engine hummed to life and the city streets blurred past the windows, Camille finally allowed herself to breathe. The tension in her shoulders, the steel rod that had kept her spine straight, the relentless grip she had kept on her emotions, all of it loosened, if only slightly. She wasn't foolish enough to think this was the end of anything. Wilkins was gone, stripped of the power he had abused for years, but there were others like him. Men who wore their uniforms like armor, not to serve, but to dominate. Men who saw people like her as challenges instead of human beings. That war wasn't over, but for today at least, she had won. Justice had been carved into the bones of the system, a scar that wouldn't fade easily, and Wilkins, for the first time in his life, had learned what it meant to be powerless. The weight of that realization settled over her as she turned her gaze toward the city stretching out before her, neon lights flickering in the distance, the hum of traffic filling the spaces between them. She had spent years learning how the world worked, how justice was not given but taken, how power only shifted when the right people were willing to seize it. And today she had done just that. Today she had made sure that the right man had finally faced the consequences of the life he had chosen to lead. Eastwood let the silence linger between them for a moment before finally speaking. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice carrying no judgment, only curiosity. Camille didn't answer right away. She let the question settle, let the weight of everything that had happened today sink in before finally turning her head to look at him. "Now," she repeated, a small smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "Now we see who's next."